So if we also wanted to create like a little bit of a base, it looks like there's some sort of like a little foot base here. Let's come back just slightly. Let's hold down the Shift key with the Move tool, and we'll create another copy of this piece. Hold down the Shift key again, and we're just going to scale this all the way out, just clicking on these tangent points, and then back and forth in between the center of it. And we're going to move this just underneath the plate where it looks like it's been welded together. Now it also looks like that these guys are probably up just a slight bit higher, so we'll grab both of them and pull them up somewhere right around in here. And this guy, we'll move him up just a bit as well. We'll create just a slight bit more thickness on this foot piece, and there we go. Not a bad start, but remember that modeling in 3D is all about having a little bit of fun with it, going in and quickly throwing down shapes and making something cool when you're done. There is no perfect modeler who always gets the shapes absolutely perfectly correct every single time. It's all about going in and sort of, looking at your reference image, looking at what it is that you're trying to make, getting feedback from your peers, and maybe getting another set of eyes on the object and saying, well, actually, I think your scale's off here, or maybe you need to move this piece up a little bit more. That's all part of what 3D modeling is all about. Now, the next thing I want to do is make a few more minor adjustments to our mesh by scaling this guy up. And I'm going to take a look at this shape here. Now, this is going to be a little bit more custom than just a box, since there's a little bit of a rounded shape on it. But I think a good choice would be the chamfer box. And so if we start with rather than our standard primitives, if we switch this over to extended primitives, let's go to a chamfer box. We'll start with this guy by just dragging him out in sort of a general idea of the size and scale that we need. Give it a little bit of height, and then sort of find a little bit of a roll-off sweet spot for our edges. And once we're happy with that, we just left-click to finish the object creation. And so now that we have this, we can also go into the Modify tab and make a few more adjustments to the fillet amount. If we wanted to make it much softer, we can go in and sort of adjust the height and the width. And this is one of those sort of a rare shapes where you probably want to try to get it a little bit as close as you can here inside the dialog box before you just start scaling it out. Because that can actually warp some of the edges and the corners and stuff to a way that you're not exactly happy with. So once we have a shape that looks pretty good, it's not too bad, we'll bring this fillet amount down just a bit, somewhere right around in there. We'll check our topology, and if it looks like it needs a little bit more iterations, we can always go into the segments here and really round that off so it's nice and soft. And so if we switch to our Move tool, we can right-click on all of these spinners here and make sure that the object is centered perfectly in 3D space. And from here, just kind of drag it up and move it where it needs to go. And if we want it to get just a bit thinner, we can always adjust that here using the width until it rests just about right on top of our bench. So that looks pretty good. Now, if your assets start to sort of overtake your image plane, right now it's getting a little harder to see it, we can always grab everything in the scene, and what we're going to use is called the working pivot. And here in just a little while, we'll be talking about how to use the working pivot to mirror the stuff you create over here onto the other side. But what we want to do is, because if you use the scale tool right now, the scale tool is going to scale from the very center of the object selection, which will probably put you off of the grid. But if we go into our hierarchy tab where we set our pivot points, we can click on the use working pivot, and that allows us to have sort of a temporary pivot point which is perfectly aligned at the 0, 0. So from here we can scale this guy down, and now our objects are a little bit more reasonably sized so that we're not blocking our view plane as we go in and make adjustments to this mesh. And when you're happy with that and you've got your scale, make sure you go ahead and left click on use working pivot again. And this exits you out of the working pivot, and from here you want to left click on effect pivot only. So now your pivot point is back to each object's individual space. Now from here, even after doing this, I'm always looking at small parts of the mesh that I'm noticing look like they need a little bit more adjusting. For example, this probably needs to be slightly thicker, or longer rather. This probably needs to come out a little bit further. So now that we have these parts of the bench worked out, let's start looking at some of these top pieces. Now it looks like that the dumbbells here on the end are a series of cylindrical shapes, as well as this sort of a tube shape that we see here. And so just like before with our boxes, I'll go into our standard primitives. I'll quickly make a tube with a little bit of thickness, and we can always adjust this later. I'll go to the rotate tool. Make sure that he's rotated at exactly 90 degrees by using this dialog box here. Adjust the radiuses of him, whether it's the innermost part and the radius 2, till we get it just about right. And from here, since our pivot point is over here along this side, I want to recenter the pivot point by going to the Hierarchy tab, Effect Pivot Only, Center to Object. From here, I'm going to switch to the Move tool. I'm going to zero these guys out so that we know that he's perfectly on the grid. And get this guy up somewhere right along the top. It looks like he needs to be a bit longer, so we'll adjust the height segment. Which, as you notice, as we increase the height segment, the pivot point stays exactly where it is. So we want to be careful that rather than adjusting the height segment from the rollout, we actually just go ahead and use our scale tool. So we scale him out. What we're looking at is a very sort of a thin pipe here. Somewhere right around in there is probably a good start. So once we're happy with that, let's throw down a few cylinders. We'll go into cylinder. We'll drag it up. And we don't need any height segments, so we can zero that back out, or rather set that back to 1. We'll use our rotate tool. Make sure that this is set to 90. And then we'll go into our left view to adjust it right along the top so that the center of it is just about in the middle of that tube that we created. And so we'll find from a top view, looks like we were off just a bit. We can center them out here. And that should be pretty close. So we can adjust the thickness of it as needed. And once we're happy with the general position of it, of the biggest one, we're looking at mostly this really, really large, thick one here. Let's scale that in. It looks like there's a few more, so let's hold down the Shift key and drag out a copy of this guy. Make him a little bit thinner, or rather a little bit smaller. Drag him out. We'll make a couple more smaller ones. Copy, scale. Maybe this guy's a superhero and he's lifting all sorts of really heavy weights. So we'll make a couple extra. And from here, maybe we can even make 2 or 3 copies. It deviates from the concept just a bit, but remember that part of working in game assets is that you can always sort of stretch the truth or your imagination just a bit. Maybe this is, Thor, and he's got a bent bar because he's been lifting, hundreds and thousands of pounds. Whatever it is that you want to do, whether you want to stick exactly to the reference or you want to be a little bit creative, that's fine. It does look like this bar looks a little bit puny right now compared to the one that we have up here, so we can make yet another adjustment for it. We can scale this guy back out, give it a little bit more thickness, and there we go. So not a bad start. We've got a few more areas that we're going to clean up and a few more pieces of the mesh that we obviously we're focused just on this, and then we'll go ahead and mirror them over here in just a second. But first, let's focus on grabbing this piece here. And what I want to do is I want to create a C extent which will sort of act as the clamps that kind of come up and down around the side to hold the bars here in place. And so if we right-click, what we're going to select is Hide Unselected. And this will hide everything else in the scene except for the things that we have selected. And so in this case, obviously, these 2 guys are left over. And if we want to bring everything back up into the scene, we can right-click, Unhide All. And so that's a quick way to, quickly isolate some of the pieces and parts that you only want to work on or see. So we'll hide Unselected. Now what I'll do is I'll start with the pull-down menu here under Standard Primitives. We'll go to our Extended Primitives, and we'll pull out a C extent. And we'll just kind of grab this and kind of eyeball the shape, give it a little bit of thickness. And that looks pretty good. From here, we can kind of adjust it some more if we need to, but let's start by centering the pivot and then moving the object to the 0, 0, just to make sure that it is centered out in our world space. Now we'll go ahead and rotate around, and we're going to switch this to a left view. We can make sure that down here along the X that we set this to 180 degrees, and that's going to go ahead and ensure that it's perfectly centered out and spun around exactly straight up and down, as you can see if we go back and forth to the left and right views. And so from here, what I want to do is move this guy up just a bit until he seats just about in the center of this bar. Down here, go ahead and hit negative 90 on that as well. You can play with any of these values to get it correct. So from here, we'll switch back to the perspective view and just move him along till he's just about centered out on this bar. And if we go to a front view, we can sort of ensure that everything lines up correctly. Now, right now, it looks like that our bar is actually offset. So let's right-click, unhide all. And if we press F3, this will go into wireframe mode as sort of an X-ray view where you can see through everything. Let's grab all these guys and make sure that everything kind of centers out on our primary bar. And then we want to grab our C extent and pull him out just a bit. We can scale it down just slightly. Somewhere right around in here looks pretty good. And go back to the perspective view. And remember that while we are in wireframe view, F3 is the toggle to go back and forth for that. So for now, just sort of a basic clamp like that's probably going to work out for what we want to do here. Let's grab all of these guys here and drag select the whole thing up. We're going to move it up just slightly because it looks like there's an extra bar here that kind of connects to that clamp. So we'll grab this box. We'll hold down the Shift key to create a duplicate and drag it straight up. Make a copy. We'll scale it down just slightly. And what we want to do here is we want to make this as like a base for the C extent primitive that we created earlier. So let's just pull this guy down, just so it looks like it kind of slides in there. And maybe scale him in or out just a slight bit, depending on what you need. So that looks pretty good. Now that we have our shapes mostly lined up, the next thing that we want to do is we want to take all of these shapes that we have modeled here along the right-hand side and mirror them over to the left-hand side. Now, the quickest way to do that is to grab all of our objects that we want to mirror, in which case we don't need the center bar. We just want these pieces here along the right that we know are going to mirror off to the left side over here. And we're going to take advantage of that working pivot again by clicking on the Hierarchy tab, click Use Working Pivot, and that'll put the pivot point, as you remember, right dead center at the 0, 0. And so with those guys selected, up here along the top, we can use the Mirror tool, and this will allow us to create a copy along the axes that you have for your pivot point. In which case, what we want to do is we want this to be along the y-axis, and we want to make sure that we create this as a copy. Go ahead and press OK, and then make sure that you exit out of Use Working Pivot. And so now we have our objects mirrored over, and so we only would need to model just one set of the side, and we have our duplicate over here on that side. Now it looks like everything is starting to get a little big again with our reference plane, so we can grab everything, go to Use Working Pivot, and let's scale everything down again just slightly. And that's looking pretty good. Let's exit out of Use Working Pivot. Now that we have the majority of the shapes in place, there's a few polish tasks that we can do next. We can take some of these pieces and start to sort of scale them and really make sure that we've matched our scale about as best as we possibly can for our reference image. And so, for example, our bench right now has the bars up considerably high. And so if we want to pull those guys down, let's grab all of these parts. And we'll pull them down just slightly, a little bit more, so that the guy who's laying on the table here is able to, actually reach the bars. And maybe we want to scale these parts down slightly again. And just sort of going through and looking at all the different pieces that we have, whether we need to make a few adjustments to scale, whether we need to readjust sort of the position on where things go, whatever it is that we need to do to kind of match the silhouette of the reference image, this is sort of what your last pass will be. It'll be going in and addressing any of those little issues to kind of get it finished and wrapped up so that you're happy with the overall shape. Another part that's an important pass is to go in and do a little bit more extra details. Things like these small little bits here, things like the extra weights that we may have if we wanted to create like some sort of like a little bracket piece here, whether we needed to model in anything for grips, or any of the additional little small details. Once you've sort of nailed the perspective view frame that you have here, which is fairly close to the concept, the next and final pass will be just going in and adding some of those extra details. And so a couple quick ones that we could do is we could start by adding a quick cylinder. I'll just throw one down right around in here. I'll rotate this, make sure that it's rotated at 90 degrees. I'll move it up. And if I grab the spinner here in the center, I can move it along the X and the Y axes at the same time. I'm not bound by just clicking on the X, Y, or Z. If I hover my mouse around the sort of average point between them, you'll notice that it's turning the gizmo yellow, and this allows me to manipulate the object in different axes at the same time. And so the next part, we can kind of circle around and take a quick look. It looks like it's fairly small, so maybe we scale this guy down and out. And sometimes when you're creating 3D objects, you don't exactly know how everything is constructed, and that's fine. The goal is just to sort of use your best guess, because if you don't know what every single piece of this is, there's a good chance that the person who's playing your game isn't going to know either. And so it's fine to take a little bit of creative liberty in some of these details that you add. And so, for example, I'll throw that cylinder down. I'll throw another sphere and just kind of move him into position. If I go into a front view, we can sort of get it straight in the front view. Maybe scale him down just a bit, and then go into our top view, move him into position. And so maybe we can imagine this is like some sort of like a little knob or like a gear or something that you would use to adjust the height of the bars. Kind of zoom in and make sure it's centered pretty nice. Maybe this gets squashed slightly. Something like that. And maybe there's an additional bit right above it. This looks like another piece of the gears. Not really sure what it is. It looks like it's some form of like a turning clamp or something that you'd probably use. Maybe this is just kind of floats right around the top here. Just sort of representative for now. Something to kind of block it out, to kind of get a basic idea of the shapes that we're trying to go for. And so lastly, if I grab all three of these pieces here, I'm going to use that working pivot again to remember that, hey, I only need to model one side, and then the other side can get sent over here. By going into the hierarchy, use working pivot, we're going to use this mirror tool up top and click that over, and you'll notice it pops over here off to the side. We want to make sure it's a copy. Press OK. This is one of the huge advantages to working with the grid. As long as you do this and you use that working pivot, it will always allow you to make quick and easy adjustments to a symmetrical object. And so if we turn off our wireframe, we can kind of pan back and see if there's any more details that we want to add right now. Overall, this is looking pretty good. We probably have a few minor issues to the scale and the scope of the object, but I think for now this is actually a pretty good starting point for a very basic asset made entirely of primitives. So if we want to turn back on our shaded view so that we have realistic lighting, we can turn that on by left-clicking on realistic and switching to that. And now we have a little bit of shadows and a little bit of ambient occlusion in the scene. And that's actually looking pretty good. So take advantage of all of these tools and all of these features so far that you've learned using basic primitives to block out a simple asset similar to what I have here. Now in the future lessons, we'll be talking about editable polygon functions, as well as a whole lot more when it comes to customizing your user interface, a lot of tricks with modifiers, and all sorts of additional new tricks that we'll be showcasing in the next lesson. For now, the basic primitives gives us a really good starting point for just about anything you can think of, but how you can really unleash the power of 3D modeling is when you start getting into things like editable polygon modeling. This is where you can start with something that's a basic cylinder and really start pushing the detail and the geometry to get some more exciting and compelling shapes. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about next, so let's get started.